You live in Hawaii. I feel like you should be more tan. That's my one. Hey, you're a very handsome man.
Yeah.
But
this is actually me tanned. So, yeah.
Wow. So, guys, the Supreme Court is just on fire, really protecting us. All of our rights are just really
I'm going to Europe
awesome
tomorrow,
and secure.
And I don't know if I'm coming back.
Can't even open carry there.
No, I'm going to have no freedoms.
You're about to be victim of a mass stabbing.
And the worst part is like my wife could actually get an abortion there. No freedoms whatsoever for the unborn.
All right. So what is the name of the case again? The Border Patrol's allowed to
Do whatever the fuck they want.
beat you up in your own house?
Well, they're like 15 of those cases. So you're going to have to be more specific, I think.
The current one.
The most recent one that sort of guts the Bivens actions, right?
Yeah. That's Egbert versus Boulay. This guy, Robert Boulay, by the way, there should be a Netflix show about him. I don't know if you know anything about this guy. He owns a bed and breakfast that's right on the US-Canada border in one of those sections where there's no barrier or anything at all. The place is called the Smuggler's Inn. And he's a smuggler. He's been convicted of smuggling at the US-Canadian border. But what happened in this case is he had a guest arriving at his house at his bed and breakfast, and a Border Patrol agent rolled up on him into his driveway and eventually pushes Robert Boulay down against a car and then onto the ground. I mean, it's a clear assault. They don't do anything to the person they were coming to check. So he brought these claims into the courts, and the Supreme Court ruled that there's essentially no recourse for Fourth Amendment violations of rights. It doesn't matter if it's an immigrant or a citizen. There is no space to sue federal agents, not just Border Patrol agents. This applies to all federal agents if they violate your rights in the course of their regular duties.
Right, because there was a case a couple years ago, a Border Patrol shooting a child who had allegedly thrown rocks at him. So, a proportionate response.
Yeah, that's Hernandez v. Mesa, they ruled that in 2020. This was a boy who was 15 years old, who was standing in Mexico. He and some of his friends had joking around, run across the river and touched the US border fence and then ran back to the Mexican side. They're teenagers doing something stupid.
So they were asking for it.
Yeah. So, a proportionate response is a gunshot to the head, which is what he received, and he was killed. So his family sued the Border Patrol agent, but the court ruled in that one. That was kind of the first carving out a space in Bivens, weakening it. And then this one this year kind of finishes it off. So yeah, no recourse if you were shot in the head by a Border Patrol agent if you're standing in Mexico.
Well, maybe we should introduce the book.
Well, let's introduce the guest. So we're here with Dr. Reece Jones, the author of White Borders. You were on the show a year or two ago to talk about that one, and Nobody is Protected. This is your new book. It's great to have you back.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Excited to be here.
Now,
we're excited, and I have to say before we get into it that I haven't finished reading the whole thing, but it is one of the best books on immigration that I've read, and I read a lot of them. And I have to really commend you because it's very informative. You're going to learn. So it's one of those things where we kind of know being in the business that Border Patrol sucks and they're really terrible people and they get away with a lot of we know that. But I'm reading the book and I'm like, yeah, I know that. And I'm like, whoa, what? Holy what? Really? So you learn a lot and it brings a lot that maybe into context. But what I really like is that you're actually a very talented storyteller. Because there are a lot of facts, right? You could write a book about all the factual things and just make it very dry, but it's a very compelling story, the way you weave in stories. So I'm really impressed. I'm really enjoying reading it, and everyone should.
The one thing I'm confused about is...
No pictures?
I like to go straight to that middle glossy photo section of a book, and I didn't see it. So what was the decision behind the no photos?
Well, you have to be a little more famous than me to get a glossy photo section in the middle of the book, right? I think that costs more than the whole book itself if they do that. So,
okay.
I'm not quite there.
Okay. Well, I'm just confused because you seem to be kind of one of these open border guys. And here we have Joe Biden, open borders. I'm hearing all about the open borders on Fox News. And so, why won't you just be happy with having finally gotten the policy that you want?
I am a supporter of open borders, but sadly, Joe Biden is not, right? I mean, despite everything we hear from the right about his open border policies, unfortunately, he has maintained most of the Trump administration restrictions on immigration, which has been, I think for all of us who are working on these immigration issues and had hoped that there would be a rollback of a lot of that stuff, he just hasn't done it. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. But one is that for the left, immigration, I think, is one of many issues that are important. People are interested in healthcare. They're interested in, child tax credits. They want jobs. They want a minimum wage increase, right? These are more pressing issues. And I think that what we see over and over again is that when Democrats get control of the White House or Congress, they tend to focus on those sort of issues that are more important for their voters. And they feel like immigration is something that's a lower level priority. And they just kind of let it ride, right? They're not going to rock the boat on that. But for the right, that is essentially the only issue, right? I mean, that's all they talk about is, replacement theory, the danger of immigrants, and the need to just be ever more violent towards people who are simply just trying to move for safety or look for a job. And so it creates this imbalance where when a Republican is in power, we get more and more restrictions, a lot more spending on the border, a court packed with Supreme Court justices that'll make radical decisions. But then when the Democrats in power, they focus on other issues. And so the baseline stays the same.
So why don't you introduce your book and kind of tell us a little bit about the premise and maybe what inspired you to write it?
Yeah. So I've been working on the border for over 20 years now and doing research, but this book became an idea for me after an incident that I had with the Border Patrol about a decade ago. I was working on a previous book about border walls, and I was with a rancher, and we were on his property and then driving on a public Texas road near the border. But in the 1 hour that we spent driving down this road, looking at the wetlands and the fence, and then coming back to where we had parked my car, we were stopped by the Border Patrol 5 times in that period of time. So we're just driving on a road, a public road. And so I knew in theory, like you were saying, Matt, that the Border Patrol can do these things, but it just really brought home to me that, wow, this really is what they can do, and they can stop virtually any vehicle in the border zone and ask questions from the people there. And so I decided I need to understand how this came to be. Why do we have this system where the Border Patrol has all of these exceptions to Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures? And then moreover, why can they do that in such a vast area, right? I mean, I think you both know how big the border zone is, but I think a lot of people still don't quite realize that in 1947, the border zone was set as within 100 miles of the border and coastlines, right? So it's an area where almost 2/3 of the US population lives. I think all of us on this discussion right now are sitting in the border zone as we speak, even though we are in all different parts of the country. The entire state of Hawaii is the border zone. Entire state of Florida, Michigan, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Maine, Rhode Island, they're all entirely in the border zone. Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Seattle, Boston, Miami, every one of those cities is in the border zone. So I wrote the book to understand, how did this come to be that we have this enormous border zone where the Border Patrol has these exceptions to the Fourth Amendment?
Yep. Living in Washington, we tend to think about the border as being the southern border, but we've had lots of incidents of Border Patrol getting called in by sheriffs to interpret when there's somebody out camping and they have firearms. For example, they're going hunting and the sheriff shows up. Oh, you don't speak English. Let me call an interpreter, Border Patrol, and quite a ways away from the border, or, getting on trains or buses, checking IDs, things like that. Again, not at ports of entry, pretty far away from them. So it's definitely something I've seen.
Thinking about this, I was sitting on my porch reading the book, and I live in a very kind of suburban, neighborhood in New Jersey, and kind of far field from any of these issues. And I realized, I am in the border zone, right? And if Border Patrol wanted to roll up on me or anyone else in my neighborhood, there's really nothing stopping them. They don't generally act that way, especially in my white neighborhood, but there's really nothing that stops them. And I think it's something that people really have to understand, because we generally think of border issues as right at the border. And generally speaking, that's usually where it happens. But, they have been, as you were saying, Stephen, been called in more and more. In the book, you highlight about, I think it was in Portland, when some of the Border Patrol agents were used in picking people up off the street during some of the protests in 2020. So talk a little bit more about that, how they are utilized on what we would think of as the interior, right?
Yeah.
And how they could be utilized.
So I could probably talk for another 45 minutes straight about all the things that you mentioned in that question. But let's talk about Portland first, because I think most of the listeners will remember that in the summer of 2020, there were the protests across the US, and there were armed federal agents at a lot of these protests. And many of them didn't have any insignia on, so it wasn't clear even who they were. But in Portland specifically, there were these incidents where these minivans, they turned out to be rental minivans, would pull up beside someone walking on the street in the middle of the night. The door would fly open, and suddenly these heavily armed agents would jump out and grab someone off the street, throw them in the minivan, and speed off with them. And it's like, what just happened, right? Who is doing this? What is the justification for it? They gave no indication of who they were or why they were doing it, or what the reason was for that. And so those turned out to be Border Patrol agents. They were a BORTAC unit, which is a Border Patrol tactical unit, who had been sent to Portland by the Trump administration. And what they had used, although Portland is in the 100-mile border zone, so the Border Patrol can operate there. It's about 90 miles from the coast or something like that. They were there, though, on a different purpose. And this is even more concerning. And I get to this towards the end of the book. There are some sections of the kind of post-war on terror laws that were put in place in the formation of the Department of Homeland Security. And specifically, it's Section 40.13.15 gives the DHS secretary the ability to repurpose federal officers to protect federal buildings. But if you read the wording of it, it's really broad. And you could, if you wanted to interpret it as such, as the Trump administration kind of wanted to do, could be seen as creating a national police force. So the wording says that these agents can make arrests without a warrant for any felony cognizable under the laws of the United States, right? So nothing to do with immigration, anything. And then they can conduct investigations on and off the property in question. So with no distance limit to that, right? So they can operate essentially anywhere doing this under this particular regulation. And that's what they were doing that summer. And so the concern here is, as you were suggesting, Matthew, that right now the Border Patrol isn't operating everywhere that they could be. But the point is that they could be operating in all of these places, right? There's this Section 13.15 that can be used, and a future authoritarian president could go ahead and use it again, right? Because it's still on the books. But the 100-mile zone also gives the Border Patrol the authority to set up checkpoints anywhere in that zone. And those checkpoints can stop every single vehicle that drives through that checkpoint. And the authorization, which is a 1976 Supreme Court case, Martinez Fuerte, says that it can be just for a brief stop where they seize the vehicle, right? Because they're stopping you until you answer their questions. But then if they don't have any reason to hold you, they're supposed to kind of let you continue to go. What the Border Patrol has been doing at these checkpoints is adding in a lot of other measures in addition to that question. So at most of the checkpoints, they walk a dog around the vehicle smelling for drugs. And they also have automated license plate readers at more than half of the checkpoints that they operate, where it takes an immediate snapshot of the license plate, puts it into a DEA database. It stays there for 15 years. If you've driven through one of these interior Border Patrol checkpoints. They also have radiation sensors at many of these checkpoints where they're searching for dirty bombs, for example. About a decade ago, the former governor of Arizona, Raul Castro, he was 90 years old at the time. He had gotten radiation therapy for cancer. and he drove through one of these checkpoints and it set off the radiation sensor. And so they spent 30 minutes with him standing out in the hot sun in the Arizona desert while they searched his vehicle for a dirty bomb. So as Matthew said, they're not doing this outside of the southern border zone and a little bit in the northern border zone. They do this in Maine and New Hampshire. But the point is they could. They could do that anywhere in Hawaii, any of those major cities that we mentioned before, the entire state of New Jersey, anytime that they want, and it's within their regulations.
Now, I think a lot of people would say maybe they have a certain view of police or law enforcement that's more sympathetic, and they might say, well, I don't want dirty bombs in my town. And those agents in Portland, I'm sure they wouldn't have snatched somebody off the street without a really good reason. And so I'm not breaking any laws. And as long as I'm not breaking any laws, I'm going to assume that they're out there catching evildoers. You know, what would your response be to somebody who says, I'm glad that they're looking for dirty bombs and drugs. I don't want those things in my community.
They've never found a dirty bomb at any of the checkpoints. So it's a search for something that hasn't existed yet.
So it's a success.
What they do find at the checkpoints, though, is a lot of drugs. And who are they finding these drugs on? When we talk about drugs in the border, most people visualize cartels and people carrying huge bales of marijuana into the United States or something like that. But that's not who they're finding at the checkpoints.
That was the Dreamers. The Dreamers have really big calves from
the backpacks. Yeah, 70
bringing
pounds.
hundreds of pounds of marijuana.
Yeah.
And now they're Dreamers, according to Steve King. Shout out to Steve King. Sorry.
I mean, I hope you make a shout out to Steve King in every episode because, you know, that's something that we all need to do more often. So at the checkpoints, though, there was a report from the General Accountability Office that came out just last week looking at the checkpoint operations from 2016 to 2020. And in that period of time, 91% of the people that they cited for drug possession at the checkpoints were American citizens. And over 50% of those were people with less than 1 ounce of marijuana. So they had a personal amount of marijuana in their possession when they went through one of these checkpoints. And the Border Patrol...
Keeping us safe.
In many of the states where they operate now, that's legal to have in the state law, but it's a violation of federal law.
Right.
And here's the most convoluted thing about it. The federal prosecutors don't prosecute for that, right? So nevertheless, the Border Patrol keeps searching for it. They confiscate it. And because of civil asset forfeiture laws, they can take their vehicles too, even though they're not prosecuted for a small amount of marijuana that was legal in the state where they were in possession.
So I'm driving through New Mexico. I get stopped by Border Patrol. I've got, not me, obviously, but my wife has some weed on her because I'm throwing her right under the bus. And it's not a, sorry, we're taking your weed situation. It's a, sorry, we're taking your whole car situation.
Yeah, that's so.
And now I have some concerns.
Yeah. So the report that came out from the GAO office says that different sectors of the Border Patrol do it differently. So it mentioned specifically that El Paso and the Rio Grande Valley are seizing vehicles in Texas, but some of the other sectors are not for small amounts of marijuana. But yeah. And New Mexico, of course, just legalized marijuana in, I believe, March. So it's legal in the entire state. But nevertheless, you would have that marijuana seized and you could have your vehicle seized.
So, Reece, do we know what happened with those individuals in Portland that were arrested?
Yeah, nothing. None of the people, they were not arrested. So that's the thing, right? They were just detained, right? So, and in none of those incidents did they actually arrest anybody. I mean, the one that I recount in the book, they grabbed this person off the street and threw him in the van, drove about 6 blocks away. And they apparently had a picture of someone who had a flashlight and had been shining it in the eyes of the agents. But then they decided that it wasn't the same person. So about 15 minutes later, they just let him go and just left him on the street corner and went speeding off.
So what's funny is how we use words. If that person was an immigrant and he was filling out an immigration form, he would have to classify that as an arrest. Right, Stephen?
The forms do say, even if it was an immigration officer. So you would have to tick yes and then explain, I wasn't technically arrested. I was detained because they thought I'd shined a flashlight in someone's eyes.
So, Reece, how did we get here? I know you can sum it up in we'll give you about 20 seconds.
Um, yeah. So the thing that I talk about in the book is this is not what when the Border Patrol was established in 1924, it was established as certainly a racist agency. It was meant to enforce the national origin quotas that had been passed 2 days previously, had been and signed into law. But when you look at the debates in 1924, they were talking about the Border Patrol being right at the borderline. And they're explicit. They're not supposed to go into the interior of the US. Again, in the 1930s, once it was clear the Border Patrol was going into the interior of the US, there were efforts to rein it in, right? There's a hearing in Congress where they're talking about how, it's outrageous that they're 20 miles away from the border. We need to pull them back to the borderline. That's where they're supposed to be. But those efforts end up failing. And so then as the immigration starts to become more and more of a political issue, they get more and more authority, right? And we see it expand further and further into the US. A big factor in this is the idea of plenary power. So the courts have said over the last century that issues around national security, and they lump immigration into that because it's kind of an external policy issue, are things that the courts give deference to Congress over. And so what we've seen over and over is that when these kind of really violations of the Fourth Amendment are put in place, the courts are hesitant to change them because they want to defer to Congress's rules and ability to put in place national security policy and immigration policy. And so in each time, the courts have said, yeah, this is not great, but it's not our business, right? If you want to fix this, Congress needs to change it. And that's the same thing they said in Egbert versus Boulay a few weeks ago.
So I wanted to ask you about open borders more broadly. Unless, Matthew, do you have other questions about the Border Patrol?
Well, I mean, I have lots of questions about the Border Patrol, and I guess this might dovetail into what you're asking, Stephen. And often there's this thought exercise about what would happen if all the immigrants disappeared from the United States, right? And I think they made a really campy movie about it, 80s or 90s, A Day Without Immigrants. But what about A Day Without Border Patrol? And we're just talking about Border Patrol because there's a difference, right, between Border Patrol and like Customs and Border Patrol and all that. So what do you think it would look like if we had no Border Patrol?
I mean, I think
other than glorious.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's something that's visualizable because the Border Patrol is less than 100 years old, right? So the Border Patrol didn't exist before 1924. So the US existed as a country for over 100 years with no Border Patrol. So we often hear that the right wants to kind of get back to the traditional values of the country. And well, the traditional values was having no Border Patrol. So maybe we can head back towards that. What would it look like? Well, one thing is we'd see a lot fewer migrant deaths. The reason that people are dying in the deserts is because of the enforcement at the line itself, right? There's a long history of circular labor migration everywhere in the world, but in the US and Mexico is one example of that, where people would come work for a period of time and then go back home. But now that we have the strict enforcement at the border, it makes people take ever more dangerous routes to reach their destinations. And so I wrote a previous book about this called Violent Borders, where there's a clear correlation between more walls, more agents, and the number of people who die at borders. And this year, right now, is looking to be maybe the deadliest year ever at the US-Mexico border. We're seeing a lot of drownings in canals, but also heat deaths in the desert. So one immediate impact of a day without the Border Patrol would be a day without deaths in the border zone.
One thing that we've talked a lot about on this show that I think people don't appreciate is that the Border Patrol and I mean the scheme in its entirety with some of the penalties and things that were implemented in 97 also keeps people here. The number one question we get, honestly, is not like, can I get a work permit or a green card? Those are things that people want, to be clear. But people want to go back to Mexico. Most of my clients are Mexican, to see family and to see parents, maybe even to vacation there or to spend a season there. And they just can't. They will trigger penalties to reentry. And they also know, as you've just explained, that coming back would be extremely dangerous. And so the Border Patrol does not just keep people out, but keep people in. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, we see that in the the amount of time people stay in the country. If you were to look at the migrant community from Mexico in, say, the 1940s or 50s, there were a lot of people coming and going across that border, but it was for very brief periods of time. It was not common for someone to move to Washington State and settle there for generations, right? But the restrictions and the expansion of the Border Patrol, you're right, it's the 1996 law that goes into effect in 97, and then the expansion of the Border Patrol too. In 1990, there were only about 3,500 Border Patrol agents, right? By 2000, there were 8,000 Border Patrol agents. Today, there are 19,000 Border Patrol agents, and that was over 21,000 a couple of years ago. So it's just much harder to move through the border. It's not impossible, but it's much more difficult. And so the result is a lot of people just decide, well, I'm gonna live permanently in the U.S. because I don't want to take those risks.
So one of the things I learned in the book was that there was a time where there was more open borders. However, the people coming in from Mexico would pay a little bit to get in, kind of like paying to get over a bridge or whatnot. But then they would be stripped naked and deloused and all that. But they could come in. That wasn't the issue. They just had to have these certain precautions. And then people decided, you know what? That's not nice. And then they started to migrate in different ways. So I found that interesting that was that kind of like the start of the protections using air quotes right now?
Yeah, so that follows 1924. So 1924 is when the US passed that kind of comprehensive rules about who could enter the country. It completely banned Asian immigration and severely restricted Southern and Eastern European immigration, Jewish immigration from Europe after World War I. And so the Border Patrol was created 2 days after that to enforce those rules. A lot of people are surprised to learn that there were no limits on Mexican or any American immigration in that era. So from 1924 to 1965, people from Mexico were free to enter the United States, but they did need to pass through these checkpoints at the border, the point of entries, and pay a border tax, which was in 1924, I believe it was $6, which equates to like $150 today. Pretty substantial amount of money, when your other option is just to go half a mile out into the desert and go around the point of entry and enter there. And so it starts that practice of people entering without officially going through those points of entry. Yeah, and there was also the disease stuff during that period of time. Yeah, people, they would be doused with kerosene to try to get rid of lice coming in. So there was definitely the racist stuff we hear today about immigrants bringing diseases in has quite a long history. The way people talked about people from China in the 1880s and people from Mexico in the 1920s, it echoes that same sort of language of something that Tucker Carlson might say today, that immigrants are dirty.
So what about this concern that, we get rid of Border Patrol, and I've already seen all these really scary caravans, and I've heard all these stories of migrants being sort of like turned into weather metaphors, right? Floods and surges, right? What about this idea that if we didn't have Border Patrol, suddenly there would be a great emptying of Central America? Everybody wants to live here because it's so free and amazing. Exactly.
Yeah, of course. Of course, if borders were open and people were free to migrate and free to work in the places that they arrived in, there would be more people moving. There's no doubt about that. But would it be an overwhelming number of people that would completely be not manageable in the United States or Europe? I don't think that it would be, right? The United States is a big country and it has a very low population density. So there's a lot of space for people in this country. And there's a long history of research on the impacts that immigrants have when they arrive in the US. And that data has shown over and over again that more immigrants are beneficial to the economy of the country. It makes sense if you think about it. When one immigrant comes here and works, they of course do the job that they're doing, but they also contribute to the larger economy of that place. They rent an apartment, so they're paying someone for that. They go buy food, they're shopping in a store, they take a taxi, they're paying a taxi driver. They buy stuff from the hardware store, right? So the data suggests that each new immigrant creates 1.2 additional jobs in addition to the one that they're doing. So it would be a better place if we had that. And we could reorient the billions and billions of dollars that we spend today making it dangerous and violent to cross the border into other things to support the healthcare of people, to support job training programs if you want to train people to do jobs to contribute to the community. So there would be a whole series of knock-on effects that would be much better than the violence and death that we impose on people just trying to move for work today.
So you must hear about the Border Patrol agents today, their union. And I'm not quite clear. Maybe you can clear up like how much they really speak for the average agent. But they're bitching and moaning a lot lately, right? They say their morale is very low because they can't do their job and all that. So what are your thoughts about kind of their complaints with the way things are running?
So the Border Patrol union, I think people hear the word union and think, oh, unions must be good. But I think we should always put police unions in a separate category to essentially all other unions, right? Because they serve very different purposes. The Border Patrol union has a membership that includes, I think, more than 75% of the agents. So it does, I think, represent the views of most of the agents. And the thing you should know about the Border Patrol Union is they were one of the very first organizations to endorse Donald Trump at the beginning of his campaign, way before he'd won any primaries or anything like that. They were on board with Trump. And in the years since, they've continued to be, right? So they certainly share the radical views of Trump and his supporters about immigrants and about immigration. And, really, that shouldn't be surprising, right? If someone takes a job as a Border Patrol agent, they think it's important to do this, right? They think it's a legitimate thing to use violence to prevent people from moving from one place to another. So it shouldn't be too surprising that anything that restricts that is going to be something they complain about. I think, moreover, though, their line is very similar to the Fox News line that they want Trump back in power or somebody like Trump. And so they're willing to criticize Biden, even if he's not doing the things that they suggest that he's actually doing. So it's similar, I think, to the disinformation regimes of Fox News.
We've talked to people who are open borders advocates, and borders can be different degrees of open. So even between Yakima and Seattle, there's a sign at one point that says, you can't bring any homegrown fruit past this point because of some sort of apple maggot or something like that. So now it's just a posted rule, but that's some kind of border that exists with rules. And then if I keep going and I go to Canada, there's a border there, but it's fairly open between these two countries, although we got kind of harassed coming back from Canada one time. So not that open, but, somewhat so. And then there's the border between here and Idaho where the laws completely change, but we're not really impeded from going there. And then there's the southern border with Mexico where some of the things you've talked about, really aggressive checks, strict limitations on who can or can't go through. And so I'm curious, sort of like on the scale, if we imagine open borders as a scale, where do you fall? Like what kind of rules do you think should exist, if any? Because we've also talked to people who say, there should be no rules whatsoever. So what is your sort of idea of how the international borders with the United States should be structured?
It's somewhere in the middle of what you were just describing. I mean, I think we have currently in the US a system of open borders between states, right? We have fairly powerful individual states that set a lot of the different rules. Like here in Hawaii, we have strict gun rules. We have very low gun deaths, lower than most of Europe in terms of gun deaths here in Hawaii. So there are different sets of rules in different states, but you're allowed to move freely between those places. If you move to Hawaii, you become a citizen of the state of Hawaii. You pay taxes here, you get your driver's license here, you follow the rules here. But I'm free to move to New Jersey. I don't think I would ever do that, but
who would do that?
Yeah, it's an option, but some
gross.
people have. So
talk to me before you do it.
But I can, right? But when I move to New Jersey, I follow the rules there. I pay taxes there. I could envision a global system that looks something like that, right? I mean, if we can make that work for 330 million people in the United States, there's no reason. And similarly, the European Union makes that work for hundreds of millions of people in Europe with very similar sorts of abilities. You can move between different countries in Europe, in the EU. You can work in those countries. You can live there permanently in those spaces. So I think a world looks like that. That's the world that we should be striving towards.
It's kind of an interesting example, actually, because, we have this idea, or a lot of people have this idea that everyone would want to immediately come here. So we have to not let them. But Hawaii is universally in the United States understood to be an amazing place, right? It's so beautiful. Everyone wants to go there. And yet people live in much worse places with the option to move to Hawaii whenever they could move there tomorrow.
Yeah.
People live in Yakima. I mean, look at me. I'm living in Yakima when I could live in Hawaii, and I just don't. Like, I have reasons for staying and, whatever. So I think that's actually kind of a useful example if you're dealing with, maybe family around. We're a ways from Thanksgiving, but when Thanksgiving comes, for trying to get people to understand, like, how just because you open up a border doesn't mean that suddenly everybody wants to move.
Yeah, it's funny. The vast majority of my clients I would classify them as refugees. I've had very few clients, a very low percentage, that actually wanted to come to the United States prior to having issues that made them come. So we're not that great, let's be honest. It's hard. It's a hard place to live.
Yeah, I think one last point about that, the U.S. comparison, there are pretty big income differences between different states, right? I think the average income in Maryland, for example, is almost double the income in West Virginia, which is right beside it. They share a border, right? But that hasn't resulted in a just complete outflow of people from West Virginia because people live there for other reasons, right? And I think that if we had a global system with freedom of movement, we would see a similar sort of thing. Some people would move, but a lot of people would stay. And that's what we've seen in Europe as well. One fact that often surprises people, before the UK left the European Union, the country that had the largest share of their population living in another EU state were people from the UK who had left the UK and had gone to another place in Europe, mostly Portugal and Spain. But it wasn't the poorer countries moving to the richer countries. That did happen to some extent, but it was different movements that you might not have expected.
Really interesting. Dr. Reece Jones. Matthew, do you have any other questions before we...
Well, so we're going to put you in charge of Border Patrol. How would you reform it?
Well, I mean, I should start by saying that's a job I would never take. But there are some things we could do. I think the first thing is the border zone really needs to be shrunk, right? Right now, the Border Patrol has this enormous 100-mile zone where they have all these special authority to operate outside normal rules that affect immigrants and citizens alike. But the Border Patrol, they make 58% of their apprehensions within 1 mile of the border. So there's no reason for them to be 100 miles from the border. Instead, let's move that to, I would suggest 1 mile, but maybe 5 miles. And that could be a huge impact, I think. Secondly, they don't need to do these interior checkpoints, right? The data on these checkpoints are that they're really ineffective. They spend 10% of their staffing hours at interior checkpoints, but they only account for 2% of their apprehensions. But instead, it has these drug impacts on American citizens. So let's ban the interior checkpoints. And overall, let's just shrink the size of the force. We don't need 19,000 Border Patrol agents. From 2010 to 2019, during that entire decade, the average agent made 2 apprehensions per month during that period of time, right? So that's 1 apprehension for like 5 or 6 days on duty. So there isn't that much immigration work for them to be doing. Even in this period in the last 2 years where we've had this supposed overwhelming surge of people at the border, I think that number goes up to something like 8 people per month that the average agent detains, right? So 1 person every 3 days or something like that. So the issue doesn't deserve the amount of resources that we've given to it, and definitely doesn't deserve the weakening of the rights of citizens and immigrants alike that we've also allowed to happen along with it.
One thing that I think I've seen ICE do especially is sort of hide behind the work of other agencies. So there's a sub-agency in DHS called Homeland Security Investigations, and they do human trafficking, drug trafficking, these kinds of like big transnational criminal investigations. But you'll see ICE say, we're not the bad guys. Look at, oh, do you like human trafficking? Well, guess what? We fight human trafficking. And it's like, well, really, that's probably the FBI. It's probably HSI. And I think Border Patrol probably does the same thing, right? That, oh, well, there's human trafficking and all these things. And we're also against human trafficking. We would like there to be competent investigations into those types of criminal activities. What we're against is the kind of random door knocking by ICE. Or I've had so many clients tell me that they got apprehended by Border Patrol, sent back to Mexico, and they were told by Border Patrol, like, good luck tomorrow, better luck next time. And it reminds me of the old Warner Brother cartoons where the sheepdog and the Wile E. Coyote, I think, they're fighting, and then they go and they clock out. And it was just sort of like their day job. There's sort of that dynamic that happens with Border Patrol too. So saying that we want less Border Patrol or no Border Patrol, open borders, doesn't mean that you don't want serious crimes to be investigated. And actually, by reducing the number of people who are doing this sort of like menial and, those types of enforcement efforts would actually free up more money and resources for the investigations that actually matter.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree completely.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we do have to congratulate Border Patrol for all the people they save. Like that's the thing that we see, right? Like, these Border Patrol agents saved these 3 people from perishing in the desert, though they never would have been even close to perishing in the desert without the actions of the Border Patrol.
Yeah.
So kudos for them.
Dr. Reece Jones, the new book is
Nobody is Protected: How the Border Patrol Became the Most Dangerous Police Force in the United States.
That's right. Everybody should check it out. And you're on Twitter too, right? Dr. Reece Jones. Reece Jones UH.
So where can people get the book? Now, first of all, if there are listeners who do not know how to look up to purchase a book by this time, I feel bad for you, but I think that's what everyone always says. So for the slower listeners, how would people find this book other than Google?
So this book should be everywhere. You should be able to walk into Barnes & Noble and it should be there. It comes out July 5th. So we got a week and a half until it's officially out. But you can, of course, get it at Amazon or anything like that. And also your local independent bookstores should have it or be able to order it. So it should be available anywhere. There's a ebook, there's the hard copy of the book, and there's going to be a audiobook as well. That doesn't show up yet on like the online listings, but it should in like the next week. So but before the book actually comes out.
Who's doing the audio? Is it Sylvester Stallone? That's who I would.
Yeah, exactly.
I, for one, am waiting for the coloring book version, but for everybody else, those are your options. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.